Walt Grayson lived a quiet life in the mountains. At 72, he had seen his share of adventures, but those days were long behind him. He spent his mornings fixing old machines in his cluttered workshop and his evenings sipping tea by the fire. People in town called him Old Walt, and he liked it that way. He didn't need much. The world had moved on, but he was content to stay where he was, surrounded by the hum of his tools and the whispering forest outside. One stormy night, as Walt sat reading a battered old book, a sudden flash lit up the sky. A deafening crash followed, shaking his small cabin. Startled, he grabbed his coat and flashlight. He wasn't one to ignore strange happenings. "Probably a tree falling," he muttered, stepping out into the rain. But deep down, he knew this was different. The forest was alive with the sound of rain and wind, but as Walt trudged through the muddy ground, he noticed something unusual. Smoke. It curled up into the air, black against the stormy sky. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, leading him to a small clearing. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. There, half buried in the mud, was a sleek, metallic pod. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, smooth, glowing faintly, and humming with an otherworldly energy. Walt's engineering mind kicked into gear, trying to make sense of it, but he quickly realized this wasn't human-made. As he approached, a section of the pod hissed and opened. Inside, a figure slumped forward. She was humanoid but clearly alien. Her skin shimmered faintly like silver under the moonlight, and her eyes glowed an eerie blue. She was hurt, badly. Cuts and burns covered her arms, and she clutched her side as if something was broken. "Help me," she gasped, her voice trembling but clear. Walt hesitated for a moment. Aliens? This wasn't a thing that happened to old men in the mountains, but he wasn't about to leave something, in need. He moved quickly, helping her out of the pod. She winced, but didn't resist. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice gruff but gentle. "They're coming," she whispered before collapsing in his arms. "Who's coming?" he muttered, but she didn't answer. Her breathing was shallow, her body limp. Walt looked at the pod, then at the stormy sky. Whatever trouble she'd brought with her, it wasn't going to wait. Without another thought, Walt carried her back to his cabin. His old legs protested, but he pressed on. "Hang on, Liddy," he muttered. "You just made this old man's life a whole lot more complicated." As he reached the warmth of his workshop, he laid her on the workbench and grabbed his tools. He didn't know what he was getting into, but one thing was clear: life in the mountains would never be quiet again. Walt paced his workshop, glancing nervously at the alien woman lying unconscious on his workbench. She looked so fragile yet otherworldly, her silver skin glinting under the light. He had bandaged her wounds the best he could with what he had: some gauze, old shirts, and a bit of alcohol. He wasn't a doctor, but he'd done enough fixing in his life to know how to keep someone, or something, from falling apart. The storm outside raged on, wind howling against the cabin's wooden walls. Walt kept checking the windows, his instincts telling him trouble wasn't far off. Whoever, or whatever, was after this woman wouldn't stop until they found her. A faint groan snapped him back to the present. The alien woman stirred, her glowing blue eyes flickering open. She looked disoriented, her gaze darting around the cluttered workshop. Finally, her eyes locked onto Walt. "You saved me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Yeah, well, don't thank me yet," Walt replied, folding his arms. "You've got some explaining to do, Missy. Who are you? What are you? And who's coming after you?" She tried to sit up, wincing in pain. Walt stepped forward to help, but she waved him off. "My name is Lyrith," she said, her voice steadying. "I am, or was, a scientist from the Sarthan Dominion." Walt raised an eyebrow. "Never heard of it." "You wouldn't have," she said, her expression darkening. "The Dominion operates far beyond your galaxy. They are conquerors, stripping worlds of resources and enslaving their people. I defected because I couldn't stand their tyranny any longer. Walt leaned against his workbench, processing her words. So, you're telling me some alien empire is out there, and they're heading here? Why Earth? Lilith hesitated, her crystalline eyes searching his face. Your planet has something the Dominion values greatly. Your people don't even realize its worth yet. Walt frowned. What is it? Gold? Oil? Water? None of those, she replied. It's something far more valuable. Your adaptability, your unpredictability. Humans are unique in the way you solve problems, the way you fight against impossible odds. The Dominion fears that potential, so they want to control it before it becomes a threat. Walt snorted. You make us sound like some kind of secret weapon. You are, Lilith said simply. He scratched his head, trying to wrap his mind around her words. So what's the plan? You crash here, tell me all this, and then we just, what? Fight an intergalactic army. Before Lilith could answer, a low rumble echoed outside. Walt froze. The sound wasn't thunder, it was mechanical, a deep, vibrating hum that made his gut churn. They'd found me, Lilith whispered, fear flashing in her glowing eyes. Walt grabbed his shotgun, his hand steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. Well, lady, he said grimly, if they're coming, they'd got another thing coming too. Let's see how these Dominion folks handle a cranky old man. The sound of the hum grew louder, shaking the walls of Walt's cabin. Outside, the rain continued to pour, but the flashes of lightning now seemed dim compared to the strange, eerie glow coming from the forest. Walt peered out the window and saw shadows moving in the mist, too fast and too smooth to be human. Stay down, Walt barked at Lilith, who had pulled herself to a sitting position. She nodded weakly, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the workbench. They're drones, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Dominion sends them first. They'll scan the area and mark targets for the hunters. Walt cursed under his breath. He'd faced his share of tough situations in life. But this was on another level. Still, giving up wasn't in his blood. He grabbed a flashlight, his old shotgun, and a roll of duct tape. If the fight was coming to his doorstep, he wasn't going down without making some noise. Your weapons won't work against them, Lilith warned. Maybe not the way they're supposed to, Walt muttered. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old walkie-talkie, a spool of wire, and a box of fireworks he had been saving for a quiet 4th of July. What are you doing? Lilith asked, watching him work. Improvising, he said with a grin. Walt quickly rigged a crude device, tying the fireworks to a metal pole and wiring the walkie-talkie to act as a remote detonator. He shoved it into an old wheelbarrow and wheeled it to the front yard, ignoring the rain soaking through his clothes. As he pushed the makeshift contraption into place, the glowing figures emerged from the trees. There were 3 of them, sleek, insect-like machines hovering silently a few feet above the ground. Their bodies pulsed with an unnatural light, and the hum they emitted vibrated deep in Walt's chest. One of the drones turned its glowing eye toward him, scanning him with a sharp red beam. Oh, you don't like uninvited guests, huh? Walt muttered. Well, neither do I. He flicked the switch on the walkie-talkie. The fireworks exploded in a burst of blinding light and deafening noise. The drones recoiled, their scanners disrupted. One of them spun erratically, its hovering system failing, and crashed into the mud. Score 1 for the old man, Walt said, retreating toward the cabin. But the remaining 2 drones weren't as easy to fool. They regrouped, their red beams now targeting the cabin itself. Inside, Lilith struggled to her feet, leaning heavily against the workbench. Walt, they're calling reinforcements. Figures, he grumbled, slamming the door shut. He grabbed a heavy toolbox and slid it in front of the door for good measure. As the drones moved closer, Walt took a deep breath. His workshop was filled with old junk, tools, and broken machinery, everything he'd need for a last stand. Let's see how good these Dominion folks are at playing dirty, he said, rolling up his sleeves. The fight was far from over. The drones weren't backing down. Walt worked feverishly in his workshop, the walls of the cabin trembling with each passing second. Lireth, still weak, watched him from her makeshift seat. Her glowing eyes followed his every move as he yanked tools off the shelves, tore apart old radios, and rummaged through boxes of spare parts. "What are you doing now?" she asked, her voice still shaky. "Making something that'll fry their circuits," Walt grunted. He held up an old car battery, jumper cables, and a coil of copper wire. "You aliens may have fancy tech, but let's see how you like good old-fashioned electricity." Lireth managed a faint smile despite her pain. "Your methods, they're so primitive, but brilliant." "That's humanity for you, lady," Walt said, setting the battery down with a thud. "We make do with what we've got." As he worked, Lireth asked questions, trying to understand him. "Why do you help me? You could have left me in the pod and avoided all of this." Walt paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Could have, yeah. But leaving someone in trouble, that's not who I am. And it's not who we are." Lireth tilted her head. "You speak as if all humans are like you." "We're not," Walt admitted. "But when push comes to shove, we fight for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against us." Before she could respond, a loud crash came from outside. One of the drones had broken through the barricades Walt had set up. Its red eye scanned the workshop, locking onto them. "Stay down," Walt barked, grabbing a steel pipe. The drone hovered closer, its metallic arms extending as it prepared to fire. Walt acted fast. He jammed the pipe into its undercarriage, forcing it to veer off balance. Sparks flew as the drone smashed into a shelf of tools. But it wasn't done yet. "Walt," Lireth called out, pointing to a glowing panel on the drone's side. "Its core. Hit it there." "Got it," Walt shouted, swinging the pipe with all his strength. The impact shattered the panel, and the drone sparked violently before collapsing to the ground, lifeless. Walt stood over the wreckage, breathing heavily. "And that's how humans handle things," he muttered. Lireth stared at him, her expression a mix of awe and disbelief. "You're unlike any species I've ever encountered. The Dominion. They don't understand what you're capable of." Walt smirked. Their loss. He helped Lireth to her feet, guiding her toward a safer corner of the workshop. "Now, if we're going to survive this, you need to teach me about your tech. I can't fight them off with duct tape and luck forever." For the next few hours, Lireth explained the inner workings of Dominion technology, while Walt jotted down notes and modified his tools. Together, they were an unlikely team. An old man from Earth and a fugitive alien scientist, but they shared one goal: survival. As the storm outside began to die down, the fight was just heating up. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the air outside was still heavy with tension. Walt and Lireth worked tirelessly in the workshop, transforming the mess of earthly tools and alien components into something that resembled a resistance armory. Lireth, though weak, guided Walt with precision. "The Dominion's drones communicate through a high-frequency signal. If we disrupt it, we can blind them temporarily," she explained, her fingers tracing patterns on a small holographic display she had salvaged from her escape pod. Walt studied the glowing blueprint. "High frequency, huh? I've got an old ham radio I can rig up for that. Won't be pretty, but it'll do the trick." "That seems to be your specialty," Lireth replied with a faint smile. Walt chuckled. "You aliens rely too much on perfection. Sometimes, ugly works better." As the hours passed, the workshop buzzed with activity. Walt soldered wires, hammered parts into place, and rewired old equipment. Lireth, meanwhile, shared the inner workings of Dominion tech, her explanations laced with admiration for Walt's ability to adapt on the fly. "What's this thing you're building now?" Lireth asked, watching as Walt bolted a large metal plate onto a wheeled cart. "EMP cannon," Walt replied, not looking up. "You said their tech's vulnerable to electromagnetic pulses, right? Well, this baby's gonna make sure they regret coming here." Lirith raised an eyebrow. "You're building an EMP cannon from a car battery and microwave parts." "Yep," Walt said proudly. "Not bad for a guy with no manual, huh?" Lirith couldn't help but laugh softly, a sound that surprised even her. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. As day turned to evening, the workshop became a fortress of ingenuity. Walt had set up crude but effective defenses around the property. Tripwires connected to old hunting rifles, cans of gasoline rigged to ignite at the pull of a string, and even a few modified fireworks loaded with metal shrapnel. "Do you really think this will be enough?" Lirith asked as she helped him position the EMP cannon near a window. "Nope," Walt admitted, wiping grease from his hands. "But it'll give us a fighting chance. That's all I need." Lirith looked at him, her glowing eyes full of curiosity. "Humans are so strange. The Dominion underestimates you because they see you as primitive. But now I understand why they fear you. You don't give up, even when the odds are impossible." Walt shrugged. "Giving up's easy. Fighting's what makes us human." Just as they finished setting the last trap, a low hum filled the air. Walt and Lirith froze. The sound was unmistakable. "They're here," Lirith whispered. Walt grabbed his shotgun, his face grim but determined. "Then let's show these Dominion folks what a couple of misfits can do." As the first red lights of the drones appeared in the distance, Walt and Lirith braced themselves. The battle for survival had begun. The hum of the approaching drones grew louder, the vibrations shaking Walt's cabin. Outside, the forest was eerily silent, as if the wildlife had fled in anticipation of the chaos about to unfold. Walt stood by the window, shotgun in hand, his jaw set with determination. Beside him, Lirith adjusted the settings on the EMP cannon, her glowing eyes flicking between the machine and the advancing lights in the distance. "They're sending a full strike team," Lirith said, her voice tense. "If we fail here, they'll send even more." Walt gave her a sideways glance. "Then we better make this count." The first wave of drones appeared, their sleek, insect-like forms hovering just above the treetops. Walt squinted, counting at least 6 of them, each armed with glowing energy weapons that hummed ominously. "Ready?" he asked. Lirith nodded, her hand steady on the controls. "Ready." Walt pulled a makeshift lever connected to the traps he had set outside. Instantly, a series of explosions ripped through the clearing. Fireworks filled the air, creating bright flashes and ear-splitting noise. Metal shards from the modified rockets tore into 2 of the drones, sending them spiraling to the ground in a shower of sparks. "Gotcha," Walt shouted. The remaining drones regrouped quickly, their red scanners locking onto the cabin. A burst of energy fire rained down, splintering wood and shattering windows. "EMP cannon, now," Walt yelled. Lirith flipped a switch, and the cannon roared to life. A pulse of blue energy rippled outward, enveloping the drones. 3 of them froze mid-air, their systems overloaded, before crashing into the ground with heavy thuds. "That's what I'm talking about," Walt cheered, but his victory was short-lived. A deep, rumbling sound echoed from above. Walt looked up to see a massive Dominion dropship descending from the clouds, its size dwarfing the drones. Lirith's face paled. "That's their command unit. It's carrying soldiers." Walt gritted his teeth. "Well, let's give them a warm welcome." The dropship deployed several alien soldiers, their sleek armor glinting under the moonlight. They moved with terrifying precision, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. Walt grabbed a Molotov cocktail he had prepared earlier and hurled it at the nearest group. The explosion scattered them, but they quickly regrouped, advancing on the cabin. "Lirith, we need another pulse," Walt shouted. "I'm recharging it," she yelled back, frantically working the controls. The soldiers closed in, their weapons firing blasts that forced Walt to dive for cover. But just as things seemed hopeless, the EMP cannon roared to life again. This time, the pulse was stronger, knocking out the dropship's engines. The massive craft began to tilt, flames bursting from its sides. "It's going down," Lireth cried out as the dropship crashed into the forest, lighting up the night with a fiery explosion. Walt stood, bruised and battered but victorious. "That's how we do things on Earth," he muttered. But he knew this wasn't over yet. The Dominion would come back, and next time, they wouldn't underestimate humanity. The forest smoldered with the wreckage of the Dominion dropship. The acrid smell of burning metal and scorched earth filled the air as the first rays of dawn pierced through the trees. Walt leaned against the cabin's battered doorway, his shotgun resting on his shoulder. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, his clothes torn from the night's battle. Inside, Lireth sat on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of their makeshift defenses. She had worked through the night, but the strain was catching up to her. Her silver skin had lost some of its glow, and her movements were slow. Yet her glowing eyes remained fixed on Walt as he surveyed the aftermath. "You should rest," she said softly. "Can't," Walt replied, his voice gruff but calm. "Not until I'm sure they're gone." "They'll be back," Lireth warned. "The Dominion doesn't give up easily. They'll send more ships, more soldiers." This was just the beginning. Walt nodded, figured as much. But now, they know Earth isn't some backwater planet they can steamroll. They'll think twice before sending more of their tin cans our way. Lireth tilted her head, studying him. "You fought like a soldier, but you're not one. Why risk so much for someone you just met?" Walt shrugged, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Maybe it's the stubborn old fool in me, or maybe it's because you reminded me that there's more to this world than I thought. Either way, I wasn't about to roll over and let them take what's ours." A faint smile tugged at Lireth's lips. "You humans are remarkable. The Dominion fears your adaptability, your resilience. I see now that they have every reason to." "Damn right they do," Walt said with a chuckle. The two shared a moment of quiet before the sound of approaching vehicles broke the silence. Walt tensed, gripping his shotgun, but Lireth placed a hand on his arm. "It's not them," she said. Moments later, a convoy of jeeps and trucks emerged from the tree line, carrying men and women in military uniforms. The local authorities had finally arrived, though they were hours too late to stop the initial assault. The soldiers dismounted, their eyes widening at the sight of the crashed dropship and the scattered drone wreckage. A commanding officer approached Walt, his expression a mix of disbelief and awe. "Mr. Grayson," the officer began, "we received reports of strange activity. What the hell happened here?" Walt gestured to the wreckage with his shotgun. "Just gave some uninvited guests a proper Earth welcome." Lireth stepped forward, drawing curious looks from the soldiers. "Your planet is in danger," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "The Dominion will return. You must prepare." The officer frowned. "Dominion?" Walt clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Long story, pal. But trust me, you're gonna want to hear her out." As the morning sun rose higher, Walt and Lireth stood side by side, ready to share their story. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was the start of humanity's resistance.